On my way to work, I pass a storefront that's been converted into a mosque. A church that stood in the same spot since it was built in the 1950s. And a building that used to be a church, but is now a Zen monastery. There's a statue of Buddha in the lawn, and in the windows, a stained glass image of the Virgin Mary. To paraphrase William Connolly, the world is not big enough for each of us to have our own little patch of land where we don't have to rub elbows with each other. Whether we like it or not, we have to learn to share space with people who are different from us, and no difference seems to bring out quite as much animus as religion. You know, religious literacy is the kind of thing you probably don't think too much about until it's too late. That sounds overly dramatic. Probably the kind of thing you don't think too much about until you really need it. That sounds better. Religious literacy is the ability to understand and navigate religious situations, regardless of whether it's your own tradition or someone else's. So much like regular literacy, religious literacy is the kind of thing that comes in different levels. With regular literacy, there's a difference between having a basic level of literacy, where you can maybe read road signs and navigate the internet, but you might not be able to, say, read a book. On the other hand, you have people with a very high level of literacy who can not only read long-form literature, they've also done a lot of reading. And that means that they can have complex conversations with people about aspects of culture that you really can only get through writing, like novels. It's hard to catch a Shakespeare reference if you've never read Shakespeare. And the exact same thing is true of religious literacy. On the one hand, if you have a basic level of religious literacy, you might be able to name off some big world religions, you might even know a few facts here and there, but you don't know enough to really have a conversation about it. With a higher level of literacy, you can be dropped into different situations and immediately be able to understand where you are and what's going on. You can have a conversation with someone about their faith, and you have the skill set to understand a new faith that you're being exposed to for the first time. If you're a Protestant and you walk into an Eastern Orthodox service, you're probably going to smell incense. And if that's something that you've never experienced before, on the one hand, you might be surprised or even shocked by it. What is this weird smell doing in a church? But if you know that some churches use incense, then maybe it's not so weird to you. Maybe in your religious tradition, people bury their dead, and the idea of cremating someone seems weird to you. Maybe you hear someone talk about cremating a loved one, and that feels very violating to you. Like, why would you do that to someone you love? Religious literacy helps you understand that for some religious traditions, cremation is actually a very special part of the life cycle. It carries a sense of being returned to the environment in a very different way than burying someone does. And in some traditions, there's even the sense of the spirit being freed from the body by burning it. So hopefully you can see why this would come in handy. I mean, imagine you're having a conversation with someone and they're telling you something from their own experience that's very dear to them, and your first reaction is shock or even horror because it's something you've never experienced before and it's very uncomfortable to you. Without religious literacy, you're likely to react negatively. But if you have some experience with this, even if you've never heard of this particular practice before, it might be something that you can wrap your head around and kind of understand where someone else might be coming from. Now, you may participate in organized religion, or maybe you consider yourself spiritual but not religious, maybe you're an outspoken atheist, or maybe you don't have strong feelings about religion either way. But however you think about yourself spiritually, the reality is we live in a world in which religion is a part of our lives, and it's been a part of human life for as long as we have written history. And being comfortable talking about different religions is essential to navigating a world in which you have so many different people who come from so many different backgrounds and live right alongside us. And without understanding comes fear.
What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing? Holy
Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus Christ!
Growing up on Long Island, 9/11 wasn't just something that happened. It was something that happened to me, to us. something that happened in my backyard. I could literally see the smoke rolling over my school for weeks after that. We weren't allowed outside at recess because people were concerned about the air quality. My mom was in the city when it happened. I didn't have any communication with her for hours. You couldn't get through. For my generation and older, it was a defining moment of what it meant to be American. It was something that framed our consciousness. We were a people who had been attacked, and we were a people who were now retaliating to gain some kind of justice for what had happened. But 9/11 wasn't just a tragic event for Americans because of the loss of life. It lit a match to an already volatile climate of distrust and at times outright hatred for people who were deemed outsiders. I mean, within days of the attack, Muslims were being targeted for hate crimes. Now, these people weren't going after others who they suspected of being a part of Al-Qaeda. They were attacking Muslims or anyone they thought was a Muslim because in their minds, there was only one way to be a Muslim, and that was a way of violence and anti-Americanism. Among those who also suffered hate crimes were Sikhs, who aren't even Muslims. They don't have any relation to Muslims. They're a completely different family of religions from a totally different part of the world. But they were targeted because they look like what many people think of when they think of Muslims. Alright folks, are you ready to test your knowledge in a game of What's That Religion? Today's game, Muslim or Sikh? Okay, here's your hint. Muslim and Sikh. Okay, ready? Muslim or Sikh? Muslim. Muslim or Sikh? Sikh. Muslim or Sikh? Trick question. Those are Yemenite Jews. And this one, Muslim or Sikh? Trick question again. Those are Christians. Shockingly, lots of different cultures feature head coverings, facial hair, and traditional clothes. And so without additional context and understanding of the subtle distinctions between different groups, it can be very difficult to tell who you're looking at. So some Muslims do wear turbans and beards, but that doesn't mean every Muslim is going to look like Jafar, who I guess is supposed to be Muslim? He's vaguely Ottoman. But anyway, Jafar looks more like this guy in my opinion, and he's the Pope of the Coptic Orthodox Church, so there's that. Getting back to 9/11, not only did people commit atrocious acts against Muslims, they couldn't even tell who a Muslim was. To paint Islam in this kind of light, you have to have a one-dimensional view of what that faith is. I plan on doing a separate video about violence in religion because it's far too large a topic to cover here. But suffice it to say that while there are extremist groups within Islam, Muslims are as diverse a group of people as any other, and they have wide-ranging interpretations of their faith. I mean, there are conservative Muslims and there are liberal Muslims. There are strict observers of Sharia, and there are people for whom that's not really a big part of their faith. There are people who believe in the establishment of a caliphate, and people who believe that a secular liberal society is the only way to keep the peace. And that's not a new thing. I mean, Islam has always had a variety of different people groups within it, who have different interests and different theologies and different ideas of what it means to be a Muslim. If you have a familiarity with Islam, it's obvious that the existence of Al-Qaeda shouldn't make you fearful of Muslims, any more than the existence of the Ku Klux Klan should make you fearful of Americans. But without that level of understanding, without the resources to make sense of another religion and put yourself in someone else's shoes, all you're going to see is a one-dimensional picture. And a one-dimensional picture always leads to fear and misunderstanding. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I could go on to talk about how Jewish conspiracy theories are born out of a fundamental lack of understanding about Judaism, its culture, and its history. Or I could talk about the stereotypes people have about Christians, despite how varied Christians are in their beliefs, political leanings, and practices. It's also important to keep in mind that religious literacy isn't a perfect antidote to hate. After all, just because you understand someone doesn't mean you're inclined to care about them. But given human nature, if you don't understand something, you're likely to at least be apprehensive about it, if not outright fear it. So you made it this far. Congratulations. If this topic interests you, I intend on doing a follow-up video about the importance of interfaith to my own faith tradition, Christianity. But there's one question left. How would you stack up in a religious literacy test? The idea for this video, as well as the test you're about to take, comes from the book Religious Literacy by Stephen Prothero, which I would highly recommend. It's under 300 pages, and you can buy it used for under $10, so it's a no-brainer. And heads up, this book was written with an American audience in mind, although I think you'll still find it relatable if you're outside the States. And a ground rule for taking this test? No cheating. You can pause the video, but Googling the answer defeats the whole point of taking the test. It's not about getting the right or the wrong answer. It's about seeing how much you already know. And just remember, no one on the internet has any idea how good or bad you're going to do. Ready? Name the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Name a sacred text of Hinduism. The Bhagavad Gita, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata, Kama Sutra, the Ramayana. Those are all acceptable answers. Now Prothero says name the holy book of Islam, but I'm actually going to ask name a holy book of Islam because there's more than one. So the one you probably got is the Quran, and that's the one Prothero's looking for. But there's also the Hadith and the Bible. Bonus points if you got either of those. Where, according to the Bible, was Jesus born? Bethlehem. You may have said Nazareth. That's where he was raised, but he was born in Bethlehem. Okay, so remember, this was written in 2005, so it's a little bit outdated. George Bush spoke in his first inaugural speech of the Jericho Road. What Bible story was he invoking? This one is the parable of the Good Samaritan. What are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, aka the Old Testament? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Bonus points if you know that's called the Torah or the Pentateuch. What is the Golden Rule? So the one he's looking for here is the one that comes from Jesus, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But I would also accept another version from another faith tradition. Where in the Bible does it say, God helps those who help themselves? Trick question. This is not actually in the Bible, although a lot of people remember it being in the Bible. Name the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. And these are 1. Life is suffering. 2. Suffering has an origin. 3. Suffering can be overcome. And 4. The path to overcoming suffering is the Eightfold Path. List the 10 Commandments. I don't feel like reading all 10, but you can read them for yourself. Where in the Bible does it say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit"? This comes from the Sermon on the Mount. Name the 7 sacraments of Catholicism. They are baptism, communion, confession, confirmation, ordination, marriage, and the anointing of the sick, also known as extreme unction. What is Ramadan, and which religion celebrates it? So Ramadan is a month-long season of fasting, and it is celebrated by Islam. For this next one, you're asked to associate every person on the left with some story or item on the right. And again, I don't really feel like reading all of these off, but here you go. So, how did you do? The results listed below come from Prothero's book, and granted, these are from 2005, so I'm sure the world has changed a little bit. But given the trajectory of religion in America, I would be shocked if grades were much better today. So let me know down in the comments how you did, and if you didn't do too well, don't feel terrible about it. Just use that as an opportunity to learn more. If that's where you're at, I hope this channel will be a resource to you. Thanks for joining me. This is my first video, and I hope it won't be the last.